American History Lesson 17. Progressive Era. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand how reform movements change society, identify and understand how women influence change, identify and understand the impact of presidential policy upon America. Change comes to the United States. In the beginning of the 20th century, a movement called Progressivism began to improve American society. The Progressivism Movement had four major goals: to protect social welfare by fixing the various problems of city life. Organizations were created to forward this goal, such as the YMCA that built libraries and public gyms, and the Salvation Army provided food for the poor and nursery care for the young. To push for moral reform, with a special emphasis on banning alcoholic beverages, prohibitionists, many who were members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, would usually clash with immigrant groups because the bars and saloons reformers attacked were vital in immigrant communities for purposes such as communal meeting locations and offering cheap meals. Reforming the economy. Reformers would criticize the wealthy industrialists and the poor treatment of workers. Journalists called muckrakers published stories about business corruption and unfair practices, making businesses more efficient and profitable. Scientific management and the adoption of the assembly line for the manufacture of goods enable factories to increase production. Progressives desired a reform effort in politics. Reform mayors worked to remove corrupt practices out of Detroit and Cleveland, among other cities. Wisconsin Governor La Follette enacted a series of steps to begin the regulation of businesses in his state. Reformers managed to pass laws banning child labor and the number of hours a woman could work in several states. Another result of the reformers' efforts was the adoption of secret ballots in elections and allowing voters to remove public officials from office, the 17th Amendment that required state senators to be elected by voters. On farms across the nation, women continued to serve in the same roles they performed in the past. Women were largely responsible for cooking, cleaning, sewing, and raising the children, as well as assisting with the farm crops and animals. In cities, many women who lacked higher education joined the workforce by becoming domestic servants and maids. African American and unmarried immigrant women often used this path to employment. In 1900, a quarter of women who worked outside the home worked in industry, with almost half working in the garment industry. The growth of business demanded workers to fill in the expanding clerical, stenograph, and office work. To meet this demand, more women sought further education to train for these jobs. Women in the middle and upper classes created and joined groups dedicated to promoting cultural and education. Due to their efforts, the number of women's colleges increased, and many of the new college graduates joined and aided the various reform movements. These reform movements were focused on increasing safety in the workplace and home. The National Association of Colored Women was created to help African Americans by providing family-based support communities such as nurseries, reading rooms, and kindergartens. Another important cause of women reformers was the suffrage movement, which promoted the right to women to vote for women. This effort was headed by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and by their efforts, Wyoming became the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1869. Soon after this achievement, other states in the West followed suit and granted women the right to vote. There were difficulties in this, and in 1875, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not guarantee women the right to vote. This stopped a national attempt to advance the suffrage reforms, and they began working on approval on a state-by-state process. For the first 2 decades of the 20th century, any national attempt to grant women the right to vote failed. Presidential power at the start of the 20th century. When President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, became president. President Roosevelt was a man of enormous energy and made bold decisions. President Roosevelt was thought of as a gentleman adventurer and was extremely popular. President Roosevelt was responsible for a program of reforms called the Square Deal, and with his aggressive leadership, he changed the presidency. President Roosevelt thought that a more advanced America needed a more powerful federal government. President Roosevelt would intervene in a 1902 coal strike and make both sides come to an agreement. The United States government began suing business trusts to improve business conditions and competition, and Roosevelt increased the government's power to regulate the railroads. After reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed the terrible terrible sanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry, President Roosevelt created and forced the passage of the Meat Inspection Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act was created to ban food processors from adding unsafe chemicals to food or creating false claims regarding medicine. Beyond this, President Roosevelt enacted steps to preserve America's wild natural areas and set up more nature reserves throughout the country. Fun fact: President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was known for his physical nature and determination. President Roosevelt would lead visiting dignitaries and high-ranking government officials on dangerous hikes and go rock climbing. On these expeditions, the president had only one rule: no matter what obstacle they encountered, they were never allowed to go around it. He would say, over, under, or through, but never around. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when a local saloon keeper shot him. Being an anatomist, Roosevelt concluded that since he wasn't coughing blood, the bullet had not penetrated his lung. He declined immediate treatment and gave his 90-minute speech with blood seeping from the wound into his shirt. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, Roosevelt said, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. President Roosevelt did not support the African Americans' fight for civil rights. In response to the indifference shown by the president, prominent black leaders, along with white reformers, created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909 to fight for full racial equality. William Howard Taft was elected to the presidency in 1909. Taft would pursue many of Roosevelt's progressive policies, but with more caution and less publicity than Roosevelt. Taft became unpopular within his own party over several issues, the most important being tariffs. Taft and many of his supporters wanted to lower tariffs in hopes of encouraging trade. Conservative politicians in the Senate passed a weakened version of his proposal, and rather than fighting it, Taft signed it into law. This caused many of his progressive allies to complain and start pursuing their own goals. President Taft would alienate conservationists by appointing officials who wanted to exploit America's wilderness rather than preserve them. The rifts President Taft created in the Republican Party allowed the Democrats to win control of the House of Representatives for the first time in almost 20 years. Theodore Roosevelt was angered by the actions of Taft, and in 1912, Roosevelt tried to regain control of the Republican Party. When he failed, Roosevelt then formed the Bull Moose Party and ran his own election campaign with the desire to further reform. In the presidential election of 1912, Democrats chose to nominate the noted reformer and governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, for president. The Republican Party was bitterly split between Taft and Roosevelt, and this division meant that neither candidate could seriously oppose Wilson. The Democrats would win the presidency and the majority of Congress. About 3/4 of the vote went to candidates in favor of economic reform. President Wilson was known as a scholarly and religious man and refused the advances of party bosses, as he was in favor of a series of reforms called the New Freedom. In 1914, the government passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened laws against business trust and workers' rights. The Federal Trade Act created the Federal Trade Commission to investigate unfair business practices. Another law lowered tariffs, but due to the decrease in tariff profit, the government began taxing workers to ensure a profit. Wilson secured passage of a law creating the Federal Reserve System to improve the nation's banking practices. The limits of social change. While the political scene changed, women continued their fight for equal rights. From 1910 to 1912, women's suffrage was approved in 5 states. However, many states still opposed equal rights, and the movement started to implement more aggressive tactics. Protests began, such as Alice Paul's picket outside the White House and around key locations of the Democratic Party. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, which finally gave women the right to vote. While President Wilson pushed for economic and political reform, he did not push social reform ideas. Wilson did little to support women's suffrage and ignored African Americans' continued problems. To gain political support for his goals, Wilson appointed Southerners who pushed segregation in the South. African Americans who voted for Wilson felt betrayed by this, and a key meeting between African American leaders and Wilson ended in anger on both sides. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.